Nisala held her daughter close as she, along with a large group of other Thryn refugees, was being escorted to a landing pad. The Quarath had appeared as if out of nowhere, and the attack was just as sudden. Isolated battles were already being fought across the system as the desperately scrambling defense forces struggled against this mysterious new foe. At the same time, countless ships were coming and going in a desperate effort to evacuate as many civilians as possible. The past few cycles had felt like an eternity, but it was finally their turn to be evacuated. They were escorted through a door, and before them stood a large ship, its insignia unfamiliar to Nisala. The name of the ship, however, made it immediately clear who would be evacuating them: TFS Ishtar. The appearance of the Terran Federation 1 year ago had made a strong impression across the galaxy, largely due to the actions of the human explorer during first contact. His heroism, defying protocol to defend an alien research station under pirate attack, was still spoken of with reverence and controversy alike. That act of courage had earned humanity many friends, but also a reputation for unpredictability. To many Thryn, the latter loomed larger. Despite their culture of understanding and interconnectedness, the Thrinthia found humans deeply unsettling. The ferocity of their first contact with the galaxy was a sharp contrast to the Thryn philosophy of thread walking, where conflict was resolved through balance and mediation, not violence. The stark physicality of humans only added to their unease, their towering forms and confident movements exuding an aura of power that felt antithetical to the gentle cadence of Thryn life. Nisala struggled to climb the steps leading into the ship. The exhaustion of the past few cycles weighed heavily on her, as did the few belongings she had managed to pack for herself and her daughter. Suddenly, the weight of her bags disappeared. "Let me help you with that," a deep voice said. She looked up to see a face she had first seen on a news broadcast about a year ago. Elliot Kane. With the weight of the bags gone, Nisala swiftly made her way up the steps and into the ship. Her daughter, far too young to understand what was happening, curiously looked up at the human before burying her face back into her mother's embrace. Part of Nisala was grateful that Siloria was too young to remember the fear and stress of the past few cycles when she got older. If she got older, carrying her bags for her, Elliot led Nisala and the other refugees to their cabins and quickly helped them get situated. Once everyone was in their cabin, Elliot made his way to the cockpit and strapped himself in, letting the Ishtar's systems run through the pre-flight checks as he keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I will be evacuating you to Shimmerweld Station, a Nithral Vale starport in the Zithra 9 system. This is about 60 light-years away, which is a distance we will cover in 2 jumps. Our first jump will be to the Xylaris system, from where we'll immediately jump to Zithra 9. During jumps, I ask that you remain seated and strapped in to prevent any accidents." Elliot was silent for a few moments, thinking on his words. "I'm going to get you to safety. You have my word on that." He finished before turning off the intercom. The Ishtar took off a few minutes later, flying smoothly out of the atmosphere. Once clear of the planet, Elliot engaged the mass shift drive. A short countdown could be heard through the intercom before the Ishtar began flying towards her destination at impossible speeds. But then, something went wrong. The smooth journey between star systems was interrupted as the Ishtar shook violently, as though something had gripped the ship from all sides. The MSD struggled and failed, shutting down to prevent a catastrophic detonation, and the stars outside the viewport flickered as the ship was pulled out of the jump. The forces the Ishtar was suddenly subjected to threw her into a spin, which Elliot struggled to correct. 3 Quarath vessels emerged from the dark expanse, techno-organic hulls gleaming with malice. They had been intercepted and were now out, in deep space, light-years from the nearest star. Elliot immediately deployed the Ishtar's weapons as he began evasive maneuvers. One of the consoles chimed a warning. Missiles were homing in on them. Elliot rolled the Ishtar, giving the point defense weapons a clear view of the incoming missiles. The void was filled with projectiles, and the missiles quickly detonated into small clouds of caustic gas. Meanwhile, in the cabins, the Thryn refugees tensed with anxiety. Some were screaming, others were silent, and all were panicking. Just a quick reminder before we get started, only 4% of my viewers have subscribed to the channel so far. If you enjoy the content, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Thank you so much. Now continue amazing story. The ship lurched violently, throwing them against their harnesses. They could feel the strain of the Ishtar's evasive maneuvers, each sharp turn and sudden jolt intensifying their unease. The sounds of combat echoed faintly through the hull, the subtle tremors of weapons fire and explosions reverberating through the ship. Each maneuver of the Ishtar sent a shockwave of fear through Nisala's body as she clutched Celoria tightly. The small girl's innocent curiosity had now been replaced with wide-eyed fear. Celoria squirmed in her mother's arms, her small body tense with the unfamiliar noise and movement. Nisala gently rocked her, trying to soothe her, but even her calmest whispers couldn't completely steady her own shaking hands. The tremors grew stronger, and for a moment, Nisala closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to hold herself together. For Celoria, she could only imagine what the girl was thinking. "Stay calm," she reminded herself. "Stay calm for her." Elliot's voice suddenly broke through the chaos, steady but urgent. "Everyone, stay strapped in and remain calm. I'm going to get you out of this. Just stay calm and trust me." Glancing towards the window, Nisala felt a small spark of hope as she saw the clearly inert husk of a Quarith ship. She looked towards the intercom speaker on the wall. The rumors about what humans could do had scared her, but in this moment, she found herself hoping they were true. The Ishtar suddenly moved sideways, as if someone had shoved the ship aside. Nisala watched as large projectiles rocketed past the window, narrowly missing the ship. The Ishtar shook as it returned fire before turning around. Nisala could hear the mechanical sounds of the Ishtar's weapons being retracted as a countdown could be heard coming from the intercom. 4, 3, 2, 1. The Ishtar shook again as something hit her. 0. The stars outside warped into streaks as the Ishtar accelerated past the speed of light. Elliot had managed to hold off the Korath just long enough for the MSD to recharge. The jump was rough and unstable, but despite the turbulence, the Ishtar emerged safely in the Xylaris system. It was strangely quiet, and the seconds seemed to drag on into eternity. The refugees all looked at each other, confused by the sudden silence. Meanwhile, Elliot frowned as he looked at the console to his right. That last hit had damaged the MSD, and it wasn't going to be able to build up the charge required to jump out of this system. Elliot scrolled through the ship's internal systems. Fortunately, everything else was functioning, and the automatic repair systems could fix the MSD, but that would take some time. He didn't have anyone he could contact directly, and if the Quarith were still in nearby systems, sending out a distress signal would be suicide. He quickly scanned the area for any signs of pursuit, letting out a sigh of relief when nothing showed up. The Quarith hadn't been able to follow them. Satisfied that they weren't about to get attacked again, Elliot shifted his thoughts to the immediate problem. Repairing the MSD would take a minimum of 2 days, and the supplies on board would keep him alone fed for just shy of a full week. The problem was that human food wasn't edible for Thrinthia, and there wasn't enough of it even if he could somehow change that. He needed to get food for them, or they would starve if the repairs took too long. Elliot opened the survey data of the Xylaris system, reviewing the planets. His eyes widened as he came across a planet marked as capable of supporting life. He cross-referenced the ecological data with the Thryn biology and found that, despite some potential risks, it seemed to be compatible enough for it to have food the Thrinthia could eat. Lucky, Elliot thought, before his eyes caught the planet's classification: Death World. The environmental conditions supported life, but some of the flora and fauna were exceedingly dangerous. Not so lucky, he sighed, running his hand through his hair as he keyed the intercom. Attention, everyone. This is your captain speaking. We've arrived in the Xylaris system, but unfortunately, the FTL systems are damaged, and we're unable to jump out of the system at the moment. The good news is that the automatic repair systems are already working on it, but it will take some time. In the meantime, we're heading to a nearby planet to gather supplies to keep everyone fed while the repairs are underway. I know this isn't ideal, but I promised you all I'd get you to safety, and that promise still stands. A few hours later, the Ishtar shook slightly as it entered the atmosphere of Xylaris 7A. The atmospheric thrusters kicked in, and the ship soared through the air as Elliot surveyed the ground for a safe place to land. He smiled when he spotted a clearing that seemed to give a clear line of sight in every direction, ideal for both safety and visibility. He instructed the autopilot to land there. The ship touched down with a soft thud, and Elliot immediately unstrapped himself. He rose from his seat, checking on his passengers and offering reassurance and answers to the questions that inevitably cropped up. The tension in the air was palpable, but he did his best to keep things calm. After checking on every cabin, he returned to the cockpit and plugged his suit into the ship's systems, quickly pulling up the ecological data again. He highlighted the plants and resources that would be suitable for the Thrinthia and transferred the data into his suit. Once everything was in order, Elliot put his environmental gear over his flight suit and grabbed his rifle, ready to head out. He needed to gather food and supplies. The ship's automatic defense systems would be able to keep the refugees on board safe while he was gone. Inside the cabin, Nisala gently rocked Siloria to sleep, humming a quiet tune. The girl was finally resting, her breath even and soft. Nisala laid her daughter down carefully, tucking her into the blanket before walking toward the window. She gazed out at the alien landscape beyond the clearing, her attention captivated by the vibrant, otherworldly hues of the towering flora and the delicate, almost hypnotic movements of creatures flitting between the trees. Her breath hitched as a fearsome creature emerged from the tree line, its massive form advancing toward the Ishtar. Panic began to bubble within her, but before it could take hold, one of the ship's point defense weapons fired, the projectile striking near the creature's claws and sending it scurrying back into the shadows. As Nisala leaned her forehead against the cool glass, a flicker of hope tugged at her. The future still seemed unclear, but in this moment, they were safe. Elliot's promise rang in her ears. He had pledged to protect them, and so far, he had kept that promise. The weight of their circumstances still lingered, but it felt a little lighter now. For the first time in cycles, she could breathe, if only for a moment. Hours later, the sound of the Ishtar's airlock opening broke the quiet of the ship. Nisala's heart skipped, tension rising in her chest before she reminded herself it was only Elliot returning. Siloria stirred slightly in her sleep, but remained settled. Nisala stood carefully, slipping out into the corridor. She watched as Elliot came in, his suit battered and dirty, his face strained with exhaustion, but still holding that steady resolve. He carried a large, bulging bag that looked heavy, even for someone of his build. Elliot dropped the bag on the floor with a soft thud, removing his helmet and running a hand through his damp hair. "I'm back," he said, his voice calm but tinged with fatigue. "I've brought enough food to keep everyone fed for a while. Everything should be safe to eat." As the refugees gathered around the bag, curiosity and hunger pulling them in, Nisala's eyes followed Elliot closely. There was something off in the way he moved, a subtle shift in his posture that made her watch him more intently. When he turned, he deliberately angled his body to keep his left side away from the group, not hiding it completely, but turning slightly, as though avoiding being noticed. "I need to take care of something else for now," Elliot continued, his voice steady, but the words clipped. "You should be able to handle the cooking yourselves. The datapad has all the information we have on all the fruit and vegetables in the bag." Talon, an older Thryn male who had taken a leadership role, took the datapad and nodded. "We'll manage, thank you." Elliot gave a small, tight smile, then turned to leave. Nisala's gaze lingered on him as he walked away, still keeping his left side hidden. A small thread of concern tugged at her mind. He's hiding something. Elliot disappeared down a corridor, and a few minutes later, Nisala excused herself and followed. Everything that happened since the Korath attack had sharpened her instincts, and she felt that familiar, gnawing sense that something was wrong, though she didn't know exactly what it was. She only knew she needed to find out. She eventually reached a small maintenance room where the door was slightly ajar. When she stepped inside, she saw Elliot sitting on a crate. He had taken off part of his flight suit and was tending to a deep claw mark on his left shoulder. Elliot glanced up at her entrance, surprised, but not alarmed. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he returned his attention to the injury. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, his tone attempting to be light despite the discomfort. "Just a flesh wound," he chuckled softly. Her breath caught in her throat, and her initial suspicion evaporated, replaced by shock and a pang of guilt over her suspicion. "You're hurt," she said softly, stepping into the room. Elliot shrugged with his uninjured shoulder, keeping his focus on cleaning the wound. "It'll heal," he said matter-of-factly. "You don't need to worry about it. I'll be fine." Nisala's gaze didn't waver. "But why did you hide it?" He paused for a moment as he was wrapping bandages around his shoulder. "Because it doesn't matter," he said finally before continuing. his tone steady but laced with a quiet weight. Not compared to everything you and the others are going through. As he finished securing the bandage, he met her gaze fully. You've all lost so much. The last thing I want is to add more to that. You need to feel like someone's got this under control, and that someone is me. My injury is not something you need to be concerned about, so I might as well not bother you with it. There was a pause, a quiet moment where neither spoke. Then Elliot's voice softened, though it didn't lose its steady tone. Look, I know that to you guys, humans can be unsettling. We fight when we need to, and sometimes when we don't. But that capacity for violence isn't what defines us. What matters is what we choose to use it for. And for me, that's keeping you and everyone else here safe. You don't have to be afraid of us. Of me. Elliot stood up, walking over to Nisala and gently putting a hand on her shoulder. For now, just focus on yourself and Siloria. I'll handle the rest. Nisala walked slowly as she returned to the rest of the refugees, her mind racing as she tried to process Elliot's words. She shook her head. She was going to have to rely on Elliot either way. Worrying about any of this wouldn't do her any good, and she had better things to do. After having helped prepare some of the food, she returned her attention to Siloria. Over the next few days, the cargo hold was transformed into a makeshift common room. Nisala sat against a wall, playing with Siloria. Elliot was sitting on a mob, crate more towards the middle of the room. A bunch of children sat on a blanket in front of him as he told them a story. He had told them about a human tradition where children would be told stories, and it turned out rather effective at keeping the children distracted and entertained. Nisala couldn't help but listen in on Elliot's storytelling, even as she played with Siloria. This time, he spoke of a great metal guardian, a being forged not for compassion, but for destruction, who arrived in a world that feared him. Yet, instead of unleashing the violence it was capable of, the giant learnt to choose its own path. It made a promise to protect the fragile creatures around it, shielding them with its vast strength. And in the end, it soared into the heavens to save them all, even at great cost to itself. Nisala found herself pondering the meaning of the stories Elliot had been telling the children. Each of Elliot's stories seemed to hold the same idea. Triumph was never in the force of one's hand, but in the strength of one's resolve, the clarity of one's heart. Victory came not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to build, to protect, to be more. Was that perhaps Elliot's reason for aiding the evacuation efforts? Was that the role humanity wanted to play? Nisala thought to herself. Suddenly, a clear chime sounded through the entire ship. Elliot smiled and finished answering the children's. Questions before standing up. Good news, everyone. The repairs are done. Make your way to your cabins and get ready for departure. We'll be leaving as soon as possible. Everyone looked at each other in shock and surprise for a few moments before quickly returning to their cabins and strapping themselves in. The past few days had been surprisingly calm, but no one had any desire to extend this ordeal even slightly. Elliot made his way to the cockpit and strapped himself into his seat. The Ishtar began running through her pre-flight checks as Elliot began configuring the MSD. About 10 minutes after the repairs had been completed, the Ishtar gracefully lifted off the ground and flew out of the atmosphere. Unlike either jump to the Xylera system, the jump to Zithra 9 went without a hitch. Upon reaching the system, Elliot immediately tasked the autopilot with bringing them to Shimmerweld Station. A few minutes later, the MSD deactivated and the starport appeared before them. There were a million different thoughts going through Jynek's head, but the most important was that their companion, the human Robert, was dead. Their escape pod had barely made it off the ship as the pirates continued to sabotage, loot, and destroy every deck they encountered. Robert had been working with Jynek in their lab when the boarding occurred, and without being prompted, he had worked tirelessly to help move Jynek's molecular sieve into the escape pod as well before he closed the pod door and strapped in for their descent. It had been the entire reason for their research partnership. A fascinating and powerful tool, yet complex and requiring enormous energy reserves to operate. He had smiled at them, saying, "Perhaps it might come in handy wherever we end up." But Jynek knew it was more than that. Robert was aware of just how important and almost sacred the molecular sieves were to their species. Now, as Jynek took account of their bruises, scrapes, and scratches, they could see that Robert had been thrown between the bulky compartment of the molecular sieve and the wall of the escape pod during their rough descent and crash. He coughed and moaned in pain before he managed to spit out between coughs of blood. "Be sure to give my gold and silver to Gabriel," Jinek recognized. That as being the human woman Robert had called his partner, occasionally glimpsed in the background of his computational tablet. They did not understand what he had meant until he gave the alien a knowing look and patted the top of the molecular sieve he was pinned against. Jinek had tried to sputter an objection, but Robert had already passed, the light fading from his eyes as he slumped forward, his arms limp, blood dribbling slowly from the corner of his mouth. Even then, Jinek had wanted to refuse, knowing that humans, unlike their own species, viewed disassembly of the dead down to base elements as uncommon, rather than the norm. Robert had mentioned something about cremation, but when Jinek had asked for details, he had described an incredibly imprecise and wasteful process involving carbonization of materials and reduction to an unrefined composite ash. But upon reviewing their circumstances after the crash, Jinek was less than enthused by the other options available. They had crashed toward the edge of a large forest, but the trees here were some sort of odd silicate, almost mineral-like in their shape and structure. While any fallen log would certainly provide plenty of grist to feed into the molecular sieve, Jinek could already tell with a practiced eye that it would be mostly silica, carbon, and perhaps a few other trace elements. The shapes were far too linear and repeatable to hope for many impurities. Even then, the final clincher was the damage to the molecular sieve itself. The two-part display had been damaged, and while the elemental highlight and selection pane was only slightly cracked, an impact against a bulkhead had shattered the mount that actually stated the quantity the sieve detected for extraction. That meant that anything Jinek hoped to salvage from this unknown moon would be a complete shot in the dark. Additionally, now it was disconnected from the ship's reactor. The internal battery reserve would only have enough for a limited amount of conversion, meaning there was no chance for trial and error to try and discover anything useful to survive. Then, their gaze returned to the still and silent form of Robert, their closest companion and research partner for nearly the last 3 solar cycles, and snippets of an old Earth poem he had taught them began to filter through their mind. These are the things that make a man. Knowing they had no better option, Jinek made their way back to the crashed escape pod, leveraging a seatback that had been wrenched loose in the landing to create enough space between Robert and the device for his form to slump to the side, enabling them to pull his corpse free. They keyed the access code into the sieve, sighing in relief as the machine hissed open to accept whatever was fed into it. Robert slid down into the device, and Jinek gave him a final murmur of gratitude before the hatch sealed shut and began to hum as the human body was processed. Things skittered across the stony branches outside the shuttlecraft, and Jinek found themselves wishing fervently for a weapon. Then they remembered the first lines of the poem Robert had recited, "Iron enough to make a nail." Opening the access panel, they were surprised by the sheer range of elements present. Some Robert had never mentioned, and this ones they suspected. They would amount to no more than a few grains of material at most, but iron at least was something one could use to make a tool, or more relevant to the sound of movement outside, a weapon. They entered the output dimensions, wincing at the power consumption estimate. Producing something structured rather than simply exuding raw elements was costly, but it was necessary. The inbuilt backup battery would have enough power to render everything within something as small as a human like Robert, though it would certainly fail before managing to process even half of one of the great stone-like trees looming outside. The sieve rumbled and hissed, a keening whine from the centering laser echoing around the small canyon they had crashed within until the hatch slid open. Within was a modest knife, less than a dozen centimeters long, thin, with a dulled but slightly thicker grip. Certainly not enough for Jinek to defend themselves against anything bigger than small scavengers, but it was a start, at least something to reassure them in case of attack. The next lines of the poem sprang forward unbidden. Lime enough to paint. A wall, water enough to drown a dog. Lime was not something Jinek had known about at the time, but a quick discussion with Robert and a subsequent search in human information databases had revealed it was mostly a calcium-rich solution. Then Jinek began to hear the distant rumbles of spacecraft engines. They had heard them looping closer once or twice since the crash, and while the escape pod had managed to be almost completely covered by the canyon walls and the tops of the stony trees overhead, it was only a matter of time before even the pirates' notoriously poor atmospheric sensors picked up something and they came looking. The calcium could be useful, perhaps as a blinding agent against a lone opponent, but Genek was pleasantly surprised when the larger excretion reservoir on the molecular sieve opened after they selected calcium, revealing nearly a full kilogram of loose powdered metal, already developing a patina. Carefully using some scraps of plastic paneling, Genek transferred the metal into an empty water canteen, but the sight of the canteen was already making them feel incredibly thirsty. While Genek's species did not require anywhere near the borderline absurd levels of water humans ingested, it was still a shared nutritional need that they both required to function. On the molecular sieve, Genek selected water. While technically a hybrid molecule instead of a single purified element, it showed very little power consumption requirements, indicating that the multi-atom molecule was already in abundance on Robert's form. This time, when the bulk reservoir opened, it was filled nearly to the brim with liters of water. Looking for something to store it in, Genek searched the pod. Unfortunately, one of the fuel reservoirs that would have normally allowed the escape pod to power a short-range flight to safety had been punctured by debris as they had shot free of the ship. Genek recalled seeing the spray of crystallizing, fuel shimmering out into the vacuum as they flew toward the unknown planet below. Now it lay empty, stinking faintly of chemicals, but none immediately toxic for Genek's species to consume. With some caution and a little spillage, they poured the water into the ruptured opening of the reservoir and covered the top with another scrap of plastic siding as best they could. The sounds of the searching pirates seemed to be looming closer, and a glance at their newly minted knife confirmed to Genek that stronger countermeasures were necessary. The poem continued to echo in their mind. Sulfur enough to stop the fleas, potash enough to wash your shirt. The sulfur was exactly what Genek needed, as it combined nicely with several atmospheric compounds to form a slightly more formidable defense. Carefully preparing a sealable, airtight container originally meant for ration supplies, and hoping fervently that fleas were a large category of Earth creature, Genek activated the molecular sieve. They introduced a string of hydrogen from the ambient atmosphere, again grimacing at the toll it took on the reserve battery. The power was necessary to produce hydrogen sulfide, a toxic and explosive gas. The excretion nozzle they had fitted. To the empty food pouch filled the container, the plastic material bulging slightly. Luckily, it held, and Genek carefully positioned it near the entrance of the escape pod, where a well-thrown piece of debris could rupture it and incapacitate any invaders. Potash was another one that, like lime, required further investigation, but it turned out to be just potassium. Unfortunately, while the metal was, like calcium, somewhat reactive to moisture, it was still unlikely to form anything more than a deterrent. So they had it excreted as a powder, one that again rapidly developed a thin film as it oxidized. It was a far smaller quantity, scarcely more than a dusting. After a few moments' consideration of any other uses, Genek added it to the calcium. The next came the parts of the poem that they knew Robert had in mind with his last words. Gold enough to buy a bean, silver enough to coat a pin. They had no idea what a pin or a bean was. At the time, Robert had simply said they were small things. Exactly how small had not been mentioned, and so when Genek extracted those elements, they were barely visible as a glimmering trace at the bottom of the smallest excretion drawer. So small they could have been missed had the alien not been looking for them. Carefully, they tucked them into a sealable pouch and wedged it between a pair of seat cushions to keep it hidden. Even so, Genek knew with grim certainty that the pirates would be far less interested in a few grains of precious metals than in a massive and legendarily powerful device like a molecular sieve, and the living hostage to operate it. Unfortunately, the underwhelming potassium, gold, and silver quantities also reminded Genek that humans were indeed an impure mismatch of atomic elements. The quantities varied heavily, and in many cases were vastly smaller than what they might have hoped. The penultimate lines of the poem contained elements they regarded cautiously. Lead enough to ballast a bird. They had seen images of birds, and none on the human's world were larger than a human themselves. At best, Genek might hope for a single plate or ingot of the metal, and even then, only if the poem referred to the largest of birds. Given that many of them were far, far smaller, they suspected lead might be as useless as the tiny beads of gold and silver. Rather than activating the sieve, they advanced to the next element mentioned, phosphor enough to light a town. This might be useful, as phosphorus could be flammable and reactive. But before they could shift their focus, the sounds of the pirate craft grew louder. To their terror, Jinek realized the sound had changed. They were approaching. A wild thought came to them. The communication controls on the escape pod had survived the landing, but weren't showing enough power to broadcast. A call for help. Not without blasting so much energy that their crash location would be spotted instantly. But the pirate craft had no such interference. If they flew back into orbit to safely transmit a rescue request, Jinek realized, it meant commandeering. One of the pirates' ships would be their best chance of survival, but that required somehow defeating the pilot of such a craft. Their mind went to the line of the poem that had occupied their thoughts for hours. Poison enough to kill a cow. They had seen images of a cow, a beast many times larger than a human in mass. The poison it specified was arsenic. This was the vital element Jinek had been hoping for, something to give them an edge. The amount of arsenic the molecular sieve produced was a tiny pile, the size of the end of Jinek's finger and no larger. Still, it was enough. Carefully, they hydrated it with some of the extracted water and dipped the iron knife blade into the deadly solution. A knife wound on its own might not be enough to overcome a pirate pilot, but a knife coated in poison certainly could. The sounds of the distant ship had stopped. Now Jinek could hear cries, howls, and weapon fire. They flinched, realizing they faced not one foe but many. An entire hull compartment's worth of pirates had apparently tagged aboard the searching craft and were now spilled forth onto the undefended moon. The sieve showed barely enough power to extract 3 or 4 more elements. Mind racing, Jinek recalled another compound Robert had mentioned, a weapon humans had once discovered and later banned, even among their own violent infighting. Extracting it in such a concentrated form would reduce the sieve's reserves to only a single element afterward. But they had little choice. Jinek returned to the previous element. Phosphor enough to light the town. Again, they specified the form of extraction, this time linking the atoms together to form a single molecule of 4 phosphorus atoms, reducing the overall amount generated to 1/4, but creating something far deadlier than plain phosphorus. The result was an innocuous, white, waxy substance that scared Jinek so much they did not wish to even approach it. Instead, they scrambled for the breathing apparatus stored in the escape pod. 3 sets of masks, tubing, filters, and atmosphere packs were available. Quickly, Jinek worked to bring as many filters in line as possible, wrapping them crudely with spare webbing to secure the mask around their face. Breathing through the layers of filters took effort, but it would be necessary. The shouting grew closer. The pod had been spotted. Yelled threats and more weapons fire followed. Several shots landed in and around the cracked entrance of the escape pod, but soon the voices shifted from caution to jubilation as there was no return fire. It appeared to be a clear sign that, if anyone was inside, they were defenseless. Jinek took a final deep breath. They waited until footsteps crunching gravel under boots and claws were just outside the door. Bracing, Jinek flung the contents of the extraction drawer into the air out the hatchway door before ducking back into the crashed pod. The effect was immediate. Even through the mask's insulation, Jinek could hear the sizzle as phosphorus corroded flesh, accompanied by the screeches and screams of those who had inhaled the compound, unknowingly allowing it to decimate soft, vulnerable tissue. One of the pirates, whether by instinct or accident, discharged a laser pistol, igniting the white phosphorus. The screams reached a new peak, the sizzling now a roar and crackle, the sickeningly sweet smell of burning flesh and fabric filling the air. The pirates' voices shifted from terror to agony, begging for the pain to end before falling silent, leaving only the crackling of the burning phosphorus. Occasionally, a pop sounded as some substance or tissue offered brief resistance before yielding to the white fire. After a minute, still masked, Jinek dared to poke their head out. The sight nearly made them collapse in revulsion. It was as if the sun had reached down and scoured the landscape. Pockets of blindingly bright fire still burned, and even the scraps touching the dead pirates sizzled and flared, continuing to consume whatever they had landed on. In the distance, the faint gleam of the pirates' power craft stood intact. Uncharted, way off this cursed moon. Jinek glanced at the battery indicator on the molecular sieve. Only one more extraction was possible. Retrieving the pouch of gold and silver, they recalled Robert mentioning another elemental form humans had cherished. Pouring the beads into one of the remaining extraction drawers, they keyed in a sequence, instructing the sieve to encapsulate the metals in crystal form. It had been an awkward meeting, seeing Gabriel in person and delivering the news of Robert's passing. Gabriel had been taken aback at the presentation of Robert's gold and silver. Jinek had encased them in a simple lattice of carbon extracted from his remains. The result was a massive diamond, its heart shimmering with the flecks of metal, the stone smooth and glossy, and nearly half a meter across. With some surprise, she told Jinek that the largest naturally mined diamond from Earth had been only a tenth of that size. The gift, then, was quite literally priceless. Carefully, she had placed the massive stone on a small stand overlooking their decorative fireplace. Jinek's species did not experience familial bonds on the same timeline as humans. They likely had another century before they would seek a mate and grow their population by a handful. But speaking with Robert's family, the final lines of the poem surfaced in their mind, lines almost forgotten, but now feeling more important than all the rest. Strength enough to build a home. Gabriel had invited Jinek inside, showing them the details Robert had crafted before his first off-world expeditions. Jinek recalled him whittling on board, trading for scraps of wood during shore leaves, and creating delightful small figurines of the other members of the crew. Now, the full extent of his work was clear, from the filigree carved into banisters to the intricate crown molding framing bedroom doors. Time enough to hold a child. Down the hallway, Gabriel showed Jinek the photographs of the families she and Robert had built together. In some, bouncing children. In others, gangly teenagers. In the latest, mature but still familiar adults. One image, newly taken and tucked into another frame instead of placed into its own, showed an infant. Robert had often spoken of looking forward to grandchildren, but it seemed he had missed the chance by a few cursed months. Love enough to break a heart. Even as Gabriel wished Jinek well and bade them safe travels, tears glimmered at the corners of her eyes. Jinek, too, felt the flood of distress hormones as their own grief finally settled, processed at last. At the edge of the sidewalk, they ran spindly fingers along the iron gate, marveling at the rust, its faint orange and red hues marbling the metal. From a small sheath at their waist, they pulled the knife forged after the crash, thoroughly cleaned weeks ago of any traces of arsenic. Its blade had already begun to rust along the pitting at the edges, small traces echoing the colors of the fence safeguarding the home of Robert's family. Running a finger along the orange oxidation, Jinek exhaled a heavy sigh as the weight of Robert's passing settled fully upon them. At last, the unspoken question posed by the poem had its answer. "What makes a man?" Jinek murmured to themselves. "A man is made of what they leave behind." Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.